Okay, I think we're ready. Welcome to the W3C ORTC Community Group Meeting number 9. Actually, just give me a second here. I'm going to turn on recording. Actually, I guess I don't have to do that. It's a Hangouts on there. Kind of for me. Welcome to the ORTC Community Group number 9 meeting, June 24th. My name is Eric. I'm the chair. And also one trying to attempt to work the slides. Special attention to the CG IPR policy. This is the link for the community license agreement. You'll find that in the deck. So here are some of the goals and how it works in practice. We generally use the public -ORTC email list, and CG members who have signed the CLA can post and contribute. Editors should ensure that the spec includes only contributions. CCing public ORTC contrib makes that easier on the editor. So now we're 106 members, yay! During this meeting, we hope to bring you up to date on ORTC, make progress on some of the issues, and organize a plan for implementation feedback. This is already a bit dated. You can find the participatory Hangout link for the attendees that want to participate in the actual Hangout on the ORTC.org site and the W3C ORTC site as well. All of the necessary links are there, the RSC chat and the slide deck. Links are all there. At this time, I'd like to call upon someone to help us scribe for the meeting, which would be done in the IRC room. Is anybody available that can help us do that? Anyone?
I'd love to, but I can't talk and write at the same time. I have the feeling that's the problem with most of us here.
Yeah. I've got 3 screens in play. So, okay, well, it's going to be recorded anyway, so maybe we can review it later and add the necessary notes. Okay, this is the ORTC CG site within the W3C. The public mailing list is as we've discussed before. You can join on the, I think it's the right-hand side now of the site. Changed with the last theme update, I think. Contributors mailing list isn't generally used a whole lot, but here are the necessary sign-up links. And then the ORTC.org site is like the portal a la ORTC, so you've got all of your information there if you need it. And of course the issues list for the API. Okay, our last editor's draft was uploaded a couple of days ago, and I'll hand it over to Bernard and Robin.
Okay, so I'm going to go over the changes from May. We had a very thorough review from Philip Hunke. There was a whole bunch of editorial fixes, which I'll talk about in the next slide. There were also, he found a bunch of errors in the sample code. Some were trivial, but some were not so trivial. And one particular that Philip found was problems with forking and DTLS. We'll talk a lot more about that. At the moment, those problems aren't fixed, so the sample code just includes comments that says, hey, the following doesn't really work, and will need to be fixed later. Next. So in terms of editorial, Philip suggested that we have a few more paragraphs in the introduction to explain the relationship between the objects. He also recommended that we reorder the sections to go from the bottom of the stack toward the top. And so if you look at the new editor's draft, June, it includes things in the following order. There's the overview, then we first talk about the ice gatherer object, then ice transport, and then DTLS, then the sender and the receiver, and finally the ice transport controller. So that's the new order of things. The rest of it is kept the same. It does seem a little bit more logical, and hopefully easier to read. Next. So we kept the editorial issues in 198, and then for all the technical ones, we created new issues. And so a whole bunch of new issues were created out of Philip's review, which we'll talk about more. And those included, he noticed that we were missing a failed state, an ICE transport state, which was in 1.0, so that was an issue. We added that. He had found a problem with the error handling and get stats, and versus the way it was done in W3C 1.0. An issue related to generation and privacy in ICE. We created new issues relating to certificates and fingerprints, and also get local parameters, and we have a whole bunch of slides on those. Next. All right. So other changes, we had a whole bunch that related to ICE, which included the failed state that I just talked about, the complete attribute in RTC ICE candidate complete, RTC ICE gatherer.close was added, and so we needed a closed state. And then there was a clarification of ICE transitions due to consent failure. I'll have a slide that goes over all the changes to ICE. And then there were a bunch of RTC Web and WebRTC 1.0 compatibility issues. We updated the stats API that reflected proposed changes to 1.0. And then we updated the DTMF sender to reflect Peter's recent pull request that got reflected in the WebRTC editor's draft, so hopefully those are in sync. And then we added a reference to Justin's FEC draft because the text just talked about the old RGP usage, which said there was no mandatory FEC, which hopefully will no longer be true very soon. Next. Okay. So let's talk about RTC ICE candidate complete. This is issue 207. We did talk about it at the last CG meeting. What was in the May editor's draft was basically a RTC ICE candidate complete dictionary with nothing in it. And the proposed change was to add an attribute called complete, which would be set to true when you had your candidates complete.
So, Bernard, let me give a little background on this.
Yes.
So the idea here is that when one side has gathered all its candidates, it needs to emit an event to say, hey, I got no more candidates available, so the other guy can know to be able to go into the completed or failed state. It needs that information. So the idea here was that it would emit a special kind of dictionary that would output. Can you go back, please, Eric?
Yeah, back one.
Yeah. It would emit a special kind of dictionary. And based on that, you can marshal on the wire and receive it on the other end, unmarshal it, and basically added it as a remote candidate. Now, technically, it doesn't need to be a candidate at all. It could be just a state transition, which we already have in the gatherer to say, hey, there's no more candidates, good enough. That's a possibility. And on the other side, it could be a method which you call to say, hey, don't expect any more candidates. So you don't need to do it this way. But if you do it this way, the issue with the empty dictionary was that if you marshal it, it's just a marshaled empty dictionary. So you have to check if this is an empty object dictionary, then treat it in the marshal. You have to treat it as a candidate complete thing instead of knowing that it's candidate complete. So the idea here is by adding the Boolean, it's easy to check what kind of dictionary it is to see if it's set or not. So if we do a dictionary approach, it'd be a good idea to add this. If we decide to do the other approach with, just the state transition in the gatherer and then adding a method, we don't need any of this dictionary at all.
So just a question, Robin. Wouldn't it? I mean, what we were doing in the sample code, right, was just JSONifying the candidate, sending it to the other side, and then was pushing it down into add remote candidate. Wouldn't that would still work with the empty dictionary, wouldn't it?
It would still work, but now you got to check to interpret any empty dictionary on the other side as being this candidate complete thing.
You could still. All I'm saying is, as Justin said, you could still use ICE gatherer state change to know you were complete. Right?
Yeah, that's the other approach where you wouldn't add it to it wouldn't be emitted as a candidate. So therefore, you'd have to look at the state transition and emit your own custom thing to say, hey, I'm done gathering, so the other side can tell his remote transport, his transport that it's done.
Yeah, I guess the issue was, though, really about add remote candidate and what you pass to it to tell, so it knows that the other side is complete, right?
Yeah, you need a signal to the remote transport. The remote transport needs a signal to say, hey, don't expect any more candidates.
That could still be an empty dictionary.
It could be an empty dictionary. It could be a dictionary with a Boolean in it, or it could be a method. It doesn't need to even be a candidate dictionary or a dictionary at all.
Right.
Yeah, right now, this is Shijun. In our implementation, we have this empty dictionary right now, and we haven't seen any problem actually so far.
Yeah, I mean, it is marshaled across the wire, and it's passed to add remote candidate, and add remote candidate then looks for it to be null. And
yeah, and then we know that's the final one. Then
yeah.
you know, everything's going.
Well, so the thing I posted on the GitHub issue is basically that essentially we have two separate methods here. It's just that we're doing the method overloading based on the type of the value passed in.
Mm-hmm.
So the alternative is to just have another method with a different name called like complete remote candidates.
Yeah.
And I'm actually kind of feeling more warm and fuzzy about that one.
I don't have a strong inkling either way. I do somewhat agree with Peter. The nice thing about the dictionary thing is it's pretty easy just to wire up your candidates and it'll automatically flow through. But there's there's additional complexity in other ways because it's kind of faking a dictionary as a really what should be a method call.
Well, doesn't WebRTC 1.0 also still pass the null candidate? I keep forgetting. I know they've also added the state change, right?
Yeah, they do some wonky null candidate, or they used to. I don't know what they do today.
I'm pretty sure that's still the case. I can go
yeah.
check on it.
I'm certain it was the case. I don't know if it's still the case. So instead of having a null, which at least you get some kind of object type.
So are we saying that this issue is still open? We should talk about it more. Is that what we're saying?
I think so. I mean, unless there's a strong inkling one way or another, I'm fine with either way. We just need to make a decision.
I think if we're going to be deviating at all from the 1.0, then we should just call it a different method. I think it's just more simple than having the same method but with two different types you can pass in.
Yeah, I mean, the question I have is there an urgent reason to deviate from 1.0 at all? Like I said, we implemented the 1.0 way, and it seems to work. So.
Yeah, I think the question raised by Robin is really how to signal this to the remote peer.
Yeah, it would get, I mean, if we JSONified it, right, Shijin, it just goes over the wire as a null.
Yeah, as a dictionary, it goes over the wire just fine. The issue is should you have this fake candidate that says end of candidates to do it that way, or should you just have nothing and it's up to the guy to look at the state of the gatherer and based upon the state of the gatherer do his own little signaling to the remote side saying, hey, don't expect any more, and therefore the remote side then calls a method based upon receiving that signaling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if add remote candidate can deal with a null candidate, then
I just looked up the current WebRTC spec, and the candidate parameter of add ICE candidate is not nullable.
Ah, it's not nullable.
Oh, that's what the red X means, right? Not nullable?
Not nullable, yeah.
But they know end of candidates based upon the SDP. So they have a little,
Well, so it's not nullable. So kind of, I guess you're saying is the state change is now the official way to do it.
So then it's done via set remote description?
Yes.
Somehow buried in there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, then in that case, I would be definitely in favor of just having a method that's called like complete remote candidates.
Okay. So now we got to figure out a good name for the method if we do it that way.
I think that makes sense as well.
I didn't realize that had changed in the WebRTC spec. Good to know.
Okay, so we should mark this as still open and.
Seems like we have a kind of consensus amongst a few of us that it should be a method.
Okay.
Yeah, I make sure to tell the object the candidate completed. Remove candidate completed. Yes.
Okay.
So is there an action item on 207 now?
Well, I think that just is it. I'm going to take off the.
Are you doing it right now, Bernard?
I'm not going to put in everything, but I'm just taking off the resolve flag.
Okay.
Maybe someone else can put in a note. I'll just put in a.
Just a comment, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, I added some things to the IRC channel about this, so we can have a little bit of notes. So I think, so we're going to try and make this a method, and we'll redo the samples to see how painful this is, and we'll go from here.
So the idea to remove that empty candidate, right?
Yeah, to remove the empty candidate, it'll no longer be emitted, and it's up to the programmer to look at the state of the gatherer and then transmit his own little signal to the remote party, and then call a method on the remote transport to say, don't expect any more remote candidates now.
Okay.
Or whatever we want to call it. We need a name that makes sense.
Is that going to be in sync with the current 1.0?
Apparently yes, because now the candidate is not nullable.
Okay. That's what I heard. But...
I'll make.
I just posted a comment on the GitHub issue with a link to
Okay.
the spot in the spec.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Okay.
Moving on.
All right. So here are the revised RTC ICE transport state definitions, and I'll talk about the diagram in a minute. So and this was revised to take into account the potential for losing consent, as well as the effect of the RTC ICE candidate complete dictionary, which I guess we'll have to revise now that we're going to change that. So I won't talk about those states, but just a little bit look at checking. And so we basically discovered that you could potentially go, you could get into the checking state if you had a successful candidate, but the liveness check failed. So consent could fail kind of in the middle before you finished checking all the candidates, and then you would get back into check. And then also possible to go from, I guess, maybe connected to disconnected because of a failure of consent. And
the other thing, Bernard, it's important to mention is the new state, because
right.
The object isn't technically new, but the moment you call start, you're not. When you call start to do a full restart,
right.
You effectively are no longer checking because you no longer have any remote candidates to work with. So you kind of do go back into the new potentially at that moment.
So let's take a look at this state diagram that's in the June editor's draft. Next slide, Eric. So I compared this with the state diagram in WebRTC 1.0. It is identical to it, although we did it a little bit different way. We say new state is reachable from any state except closed, and that is how it works in 1.0. So there are only two arrows that are present here, which were not present in 1.0, and so let me talk about those. The arrow between connected and checking occurs because of potential loss of consent due to consent loss. So we think that actually 1.0 probably ought to add that arrow because we think that transition can occur in 1.0. The arrow between failed and checking is that would be something that could be done if you had continuous nomination. So you could be in failed, like get another candidate and go to checking. Obviously, non-bis isn't yet a working group work item or anything like that, so that could change. But that's why that arrow is there. So other than these two red arrows, basically the diagram is identical to what is in WebRTC 1.0. So I just think I ought to want to mention that.
Okay, thanks.
Where we are. Okay. Statistics API error handling. So we're not trying to be any different from WebRTC 1.0 in the statistics area, so the goal is to have the same behavior as is in 1.0. But the question is, what is that behavior? So in the June 11th editor's draft of WebRTC 1.0, in section 8.2.1, there is still the statement that if the peer connection signaling state is closed, you're supposed to throw an invalid state error exception. However, there is an open issue to not do that and return the last stats object instead. So this was basically filed by Philip, and Philip said, hey, you should really be compatible with this open issue rather than what's in WebRTC 1.0 currently. I'm not entirely aware of what the state of that open issue is. Do you know, Peter? Is it going to be added or not?
I don't know. We'd have to ask Harold, I guess.
Yeah, so that's kind of the question. Originally, when I was looking at the sync, I thought, hey, it basically should throw invalid state errors if the objects are closed. But now, according to Philip, actually Justin's coming on, so maybe he knows what the status of this is.
Justin, can you hear us okay? He's probably just getting set up.
Okay. So basically, the question here is, if you call getStats on an object that's closed, should it return an error or not? That's question one. And the other question, which is slightly related, is if you call it on an object that hasn't been started yet, should you throw an error? In the May editor's draft, it actually advocated an exception for that as well. And so I guess Philip's question was, why have any of these things be errors? If the object isn't started yet, you can just have all the counters return 0. And if it's been closed, you could, as is recommended in this WebRTC issue, you could just return the last stats object before it was closed. So that is basically, go to the next slide. And so this was the text in the May editor's draft, and was basically throwing exceptions if the objects hadn't been started yet. And next one. Basically, the proposal, which is in the June editor's draft, is delete all that text, and basically just say if it's not begun to send or receive, the return stats reflect this. Presumably, the counters are 0. If the object is in the closed state, the return stats reflect the stats at the time the object transitioned to the closed state. And that presumably would be compatible with the proposed change to WebRTC 1.0. So, any thoughts on this?
Well, the only other thing I was going to mention, because it's a promise that gets returned, it's also possible to return a rejected promise instead of a resolved promise.
Correct.
If the stats are not available, or just can't calculate them for whatever reason, or they don't make sense.
Or never return anything. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Right. Just leave you hanging. But what do people think of this idea of basically not throwing errors all the time for all these conditions, just returning stats?
I think it's more developer friendly.
Yeah.
I think it makes sense.
Especially when you have things like the DTLS thing that can close itself because of failures. You could be in a race condition where suddenly the DTLS is closed, you go get stats on it. Oh, now you throw an exception. Ugh.
Yeah, and I think of them as that's the kind of thing that people put into the reason for the original WebRTC 101 is, hey, stuff closed, you might want to, right after that, call getStats, right? And get the summary of what happened, and to get an error is kind of lame. Okay. When Justin comes on, we can ask him about the status of that pull request if he knows. Okay, next. Okay, so next WebRTC 1.0 sync thing was DTMF sender, which thanks to Peter is now in WebRTC 1.0. And so I did go over that, and basically the only big difference was some spelling issues. And currently, the following things have the same spelling in 1.0 and ORTC: insert DTMF on tone change, tone buffer, duration, and intertone gap. So those are all the same spelling. There was one thing with different spelling, which was RTC DTMF sender, which was capitalized in W3C 1.0 and then upload one in ORTC. And otherwise, the text should look, I went over it, should be identical to W3C 1.0. Now, next slide.
So are you guys okay with Harold's proposition on, or Harold's proposal?
Yeah, so let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
So Peter had a suggestion, generally, which is to basically use what Harold suggested, which is camel case, except for the RTC thing at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, Peter, you proposed changing the DTMF sender in 1.0 to DTMF sender as an ORTC. And I guess potentially change the event objects, and then leave insert DTMF as it is, and those are the same in both W3C 1.0 at the moment. So.
Yeah, since they're just type names and they're not method names, it shouldn't break any JavaScript. Only insert DTMF could possibly break applications using it. So I don't see it as a real difficulty to change that. So I was making the case that we should change it to not uppercase DTMF on the type names in 1.0.
So anyway, I think that change would make everything the same as an RTC.
You know, we definitely should be consistent. So I agree. Let's make the change. I don't know about insert DTMF because if it potentially breaks, but I think we should make the change.
Well, make the change in 1.0 is what you're saying?
Yeah, make the change in 1.0 if we can push them to do it, but keep our thing consistent.
I can make a pull request and send it out and see.
Okay,
response
that would be good.
It's a search and replace. It's not too hard.
All right. Next one, Eric. Okay.
So at this point, we'll ask the CG if they feel the direction in which the editor's draft is headed is the right direction. If you have any questions about the general aspects of the spec, unless we're hearing anything in the IRC channel, and I don't think we are, I think we can move on.
I think the only general question was about 207, which is RTC ICE complete, which we'll talk about more.
Right. Okay. So for discussion today, we are discussing Philip's review, issues 212, 213, and the DTLS issues as follows, and response connectivity checks. And let you speak to this, you guys.
Yeah. So still a few things left. Coming attractions, we have to define the behavior of sender.send and receiver.receive when parameters.encodings is not set. We promised to do that, but we had so many other fires to fight we didn't get to it yet. Statistics API, I think they still, last time I talked to Varun, he wanted to add some stuff to support simulcast and scalable video coding, so we have to sync up with him and Harold on that. We will continue to check compatibility with 1.0 as things change there and the objects come in, and that includes stuff like IDP and data channel. I don't know if, I think, I haven't checked any changes in those sections, but we will update if and when that happens. Next. Okay. So I'll talk about two issues raised by Philip. One was support for generation, which is something I believe that's supported in Chrome. And so his question was, with respect to the RTC ICE candidate, there is extensibility defined in RFC 5245, so you can add additional attributes. And he mentioned specifically the generation attribute from XEP 0176. That is pretty common, and asked, how do you support that, or do you support it? Robin's response was that this did not apply to ORTC since the candidates come from the gatherer, which doesn't change the username fragment. And so if you basically use another gatherer, a substitute gatherer, you can track the generations yourself and signal those over the wire and don't need the generation to be generated in the ICE candidate itself. People agree with that?
So about the generation, I'm pretty sure we only actually use that for GICE and not for standard ICE.
I've actually seen it generated without Google ICE, without an
Well, I know that we throw I'm looking at the SDP generation code. We put it in there, but it doesn't. I'll have to go read through the code, but I believe we were moving away from that for standard ICE and basically would delete it once we delete GICE, which is soon.
But I guess I think the point Robin is making is even if that were used in some way, you could still generate it from just tracking how many ICE gatherers you've done, right? Is that correct?
It just doesn't make sense because the generation is tied to the username fragment password and it doesn't change, so you can't possibly do that. So you have to track it across. If you want to do this kind of generational thing and you're substituting one gather for another, then you're going to have to track your candidate generation yourself externally.
Yeah, I mean, like an example is in your signaling of the candidate, right? We could add like in the sample code, you could have added a generation argument and just when the ICE gatherer got incremented, past that, and it would still work, is I guess what I'm saying.
Yes.
You don't have to change the ORTC API spec even if it were needed for some reason.
Correct. And because it's a dictionary, you can always shove your own stuff in there.
I guess that the claim is that we can be compatible with XCP 0176, and app can still do that without changing the ORTC spec.
Correct.
So do we have agreement that this should be, I think the proposal is to resolve this one fix. That's reasonable. Okay. Next one. Okay. So Philip also commented on privacy issues, particularly RTC ICE candidate, and said, hey, you've got this related address thing, and you've got this related port, and it's gonna leak information, and he'd prefer us not to expose those to the app. And also objected, I think, on potential leakage of IP addresses in certain use cases. And, next.
So I just commented on that one and on the issue in GitHub, and it's part of RFC 5245 to have the R adder on the candidate, and that's what this is. So I don't know how you can implement 5245 without having this.
Well, Philip was saying you could do zeros as the IP address. And my opinion is it's also possible to have the browser kind of abstract away in a VPN kind of way those IP addresses however it chooses. I don't think it's mandated that we not use it.
Right. So I think what you're saying is we could have the attributes on the dictionary, but then the browser can decide what it puts in there.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we already have code where we do different things depending on if there's a proxy or not or whatever to try and be more private or that kind of thing. So if the browser decided it wanted to be like more private or in a more private mode, it could just put in the values that it thinks are private. And really, this doesn't change behavior anywhere as far as I can tell in our implementation, at least. It's just kind of a debugging, logging issue.
Next slide, Eric. Yeah, so that's basically what the commenters on the thing said. Martin said, yeah, it's a privacy issue, but how do you deal with SDP if you don't take them out? And Robin said, hey, it's just, the browser can do a privacy mode. So the proposal here is also to resolve this as one fix. Or do people feel there's some text needed in the spec about this?
I think we can mention in the text to say in terms of that this is something that the browsers should decide how they want to make their related IP addresses private if they have such a privacy mode. But I don't think it's mandatory from my perspective that we do anything.
Okay.
Well, I mean, it's a dictionary, so it could just have unset values, right?
Yeah, but you do need it to be RFC compliant, so you'd have to throw in something for STP to be compatible.
Well, I mean, the JavaScript library that implements SDP could just say, oh, if it's not in there, I'm going to go put in some dummy value in the SDP.
Sure, but then we have to change the dictionary to allow it to be unset.
Well, maybe we should do that.
Yeah, that's an idea.
I think that would be better. I think it would be better for the browser to leave it out and let the JavaScript decide what dummy value should be rather than the browser deciding what the dummy value should be.
Right. Okay, can someone put in proposed resolution in there? I'll also remove the long fix in favor of something else.
I put a note in the IRC channel.
Okay.
I don't know what issue number this is, but
It's issue number 213.
okay.
Okay. Next. All right. So there's also 3 semi-related DTLS certificate issues: 210, 211, and 218. So let me explain what these are. Issue 210 was if you're not doing RTP, RTCP MUX, so you have distinct DTLS transports for RTP and RTCP, the question was whether you had different fingerprints for RTP and RTCP DTLS transports, in which case you would have 2 A-equal fingerprint attributes, potentially, or you would just have 1 certificate and fingerprint for both. Issue 211 was when you generate the DTLS certificates. So different implementations have interpreted this differently. So in our implementation, we actually generate the cert when DTLS transport is constructed, and I believe, Robin, you do it when getLocalParameters is called. And in that case, you've had to use a promise because it's not synchronous. It takes a while to generate it. Issue 218 is how forking works with DTLS transport. One of the things that Philip Hunke found when he was looking at the sample code is that this didn't work right in the sample code. So when you're doing forking, you'll have in your offer the fingerprint of the DTLS cert, and then the answers expect when they do DTLS with the offer that they're going to get the same certificate and fingerprint as was offered to them. The problem was that the sample code was generating a new DTLS cert for each of the forks, and so the fingerprint verification would fail. People understand that? Basically, we went off and we created a new, we constructed a new DTLS transfer for each answer that we got, and the problem was that would generate a new cert, and it wouldn't have the fingerprint that we offered. So that was.
So wait,
yeah.
That means we need to have the same cert for multiple DTLS transports?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If you're going to do forking the conventional SIP way, right, where you could do some other weird thing, but when you have an offer that has a fingerprint in it, basically you then have to generate a DTLS transport that has that fingerprint, or remote verification will fail.
Right. So this is slippery slope. This is kind of like ice gatherer.
Right.
Except
exactly.
it's DTLS key.
Yeah. There is an easy answer to this,
generator.
Unfortunately.
So we'll see if people buy it. So the basic question is: are these 3 different problems that you solve separately, or is it really 3 symptoms of the same problem? So next slide. Okay, so if you think of it as 3 different problems, you might come up with different solutions. And here's some of the stuff we've talked about on the list for each of these. So in 210, which was the non-MUX case, you could generate distinct certs and fingerprints for the RTP and RTCP. The question that arose is if we had different A-equal fingerprint lines, whether that actually would be compatible, and you sent that across with existing implementations of WebRTC 1.0. And I think Philip claimed that you're going to have an interop problem. Is that right, Peter?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you would. Like there's
Yeah.
going to be implementations that would not expect the fingerprints to be different.
Well, no, they wouldn't be. Hold on. So what you would do if you had different certs and fingerprints for the RTP and RTCP, in your M line, you would have two equal fingerprint lines, right, with each of the fingerprints. You'd have one for the RTP and one for the RTCP, right? And so the question is, when this got pushed down, and like set remote description, whether existing implementations of WebRTC 1.0 would barf.
Question. I'd have to look into it.
Philip's claim was that they would barf, that you wouldn't be able to do it that way.
Well, we should probably not go down this rat hole because we got a solution that doesn't cause this rat hole to begin with.
We don't have to discuss it, but I'm saying that's one solution. Or you could mandate the same certificate fingerprint for both. So that was, I think, what we discussed in the last ORTC meeting. In issue 211, as to when the DTLS certs were generated, you could solve that by making get local parameters a promise and basically have it be async and generate the cert when you call that, which is, I think, maybe a little bit better than trying to do it in the DTLS transport constructor. And then for 218, you could try to solve this by having a weird clone transport method for DTLS that constructed a new DTLS transport with the same cert and fingerprint as the other one. That is a pretty weird thing to do. But this is basically the kind of things you could do if you had three different problems. You consider them three different problems. Next slide.
So I just checked. Right now, we would barf.
You would barf, right. So you could also treat this as three symptoms of the same problem and try to solve it the same way. So in the latest WebRTC 1.0 draft, in section 5.5, there's a certificate management API, which is currently optional to implement. And it is basically generate certificate, and it returns a promise. And so you tell it what the algorithm is, and it generates a cert for you. And then the promise is fulfilled when it's ready. So if you look at it this way, here's how you would solve 210, 211, and 218. So in the non-mux case, basically you would add RTC certificate as a required argument to the DTLS transport constructor. You'd say go.
Next slide.
Go what?
All right, do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah. So it basically looks like this, which is you have you basically have the second argument be RTC certificate. You say, hey, go build me a DTLS transport with the following cert. So presumably your promise was resolved. You have this cert now, and say, hey, go build me a transport with a cert. It does match the proposed pattern from WebRTC 1.0 because we have this cert management API there. We actually have to reroute it somewhere else because we don't have a peer connection object, but otherwise it's the same. The one difference is that if we start putting it in as a solution to all these problems, the certificate management API would now be required. It would not be optional in ORTC as it is in WebRTC 1.0. So I guess one question is whether existing 1.0 implementations are planning on doing this certificate management API or not. I gather that Firefox is going to do it because Martin proposed this, but I don't know, Peter, if you're thinking of doing this cert management thing.
I don't know. I don't see a strong reason why we wouldn't, but we haven't brought it up. So a couple ideas. One is, could we put the static method on DTLS transport?
Yeah, that was my question.
Okay. Another question is, what's the advantage to making it a required argument? Is it so that when you call, is it so that the time at which the certificate is generated is clear? Because if we made it optional and said, okay, if you don't pass one in, then one gets created for you.
Then the get local parameters has a problem because you can't call get local parameters until it's generated because you don't have any fingerprints. And if you did that, get local parameters would potentially block. So that's the problem.
Yeah, so the problem basically, Peter, is if you don't make it required, then you have to do some of the three different problem solutions also, in addition to the cert management API.
So it sounds like the trade-off is between making get local parameters a promise versus making generate certificate a promise and making it required to pass in to the constructor.
Right.
Right.
Well, the question is how you would solve the DTLS forking.
No, I understand for the forking purpose the value in having it be an argument with the
Yes.
generate method. The question the trade-off I'm having in my mind is making it required versus get local parameters being.
So I guess let me just think. I think there's a distinction between making it an optional argument and making it optional to implement.
There's another possibility, a hybrid to this, is that a certificate object could be generated which isn't quite in the ready state, but nobody knows it, that it's not quite ready. And it could be passed into the DTLS object, and then you could have a promise when it's ready. So that's another possibility, a little bit of hybrid. I don't know if it helps anything or not, though.
So Peter, just for my own clarification, you're saying that the argument could be optional, but it would be the certificate management API would still be mandatory to implement in ORTC?
Well, I think those actually are orthogonal questions, right? So if we made the first trade-off is make it optional versus local parameters being a promise. And if it is optional, then actually the whole generation of the certificate is optional, although if you want to support forking, it's pretty much required, I guess, right? So then it's a question of does the browser support forking or not? You know, unless your model of forking was we're going to do forking at the ICE level, and then once we get a response from ICE, then we'll do DTLS. Does that make sense? So I send out my ICE information, you respond with your DTLS information, and then I respond back with my DTLS information.
Right.
Yeah, that's not very nice.
Yeah, it would be 2 offer answers, obviously, but
no, it'd be 1.5.
Yeah, 1.5.
Yeah, that's not very nice, and it's just not nice. And it's not compatible with certain existing technologies either. So.
Yeah, I thought of changing the sample code actually to do it that way, because then I wouldn't have to say this doesn't work everywhere. But
and I really don't like the idea of the get local parameters being a promise. It's kind of an exception to all the others that are not promises.
So maybe we can go back one, and I'm just trying to. But people, do people generally accept that this cert management API is the solution to these 3 problems?
Well, it's certainly a solution to the forking.
Yeah, for the forking one, actually, I have a question. Is there any security concern here, and for man-in-the-middle kind of attack? If we allow to have different DTLS transport using the same search?
No.
Yeah, it
No, I don't think it's a problem. I mean,
the key exchange. I mean, the key exchange will still generate different keys, right? And it's not like you're doing the same. Right, each side it'll generate different DTLS keys no matter whether the actual certs are the same.
Yeah, because the remote answer is always going to have a different fingerprint. So even though the local is the same, there's no real security
issue. The search
issue.
will be different in each DTLS transfer, but also remember the key generation will be different.
Okay, all right, got it.
Nonces and junk like that.
So I think it's a good idea to add generate certificate onto the DTLS transport. I think it's I think it's probably okay to make it a mandatory part of the spec. I'm just not completely sold on the trade-off between whether it's a required attribute or a required parameter into the DTLS transport constructor.
So,
because
yeah, it could be an optional argument, Peter.
Right, but then we need the promise on get local parameters.
Well.
Then you need the promise for sure.
You need the promise, right?
So you really have a promise no matter which way you do it.
Well, if you make it mandatory to pass it to the constructor, you don't need a promise.
No, you do, because then it's the generation of the certificate that needs the promise. There's always a promise somewhere in the step.
Yeah, the promise. Well, promise. If you have a promise in the generate certificate, right? Then you would presumably only you would only pass it to the constructor once the promise was resolved.
And the other nice thing about, well, yeah.
So all of our existing example code is broken in the sense that when it calls get local parameters,
Right.
it might not be there. It might not be ready.
Yeah, and it might not be ready, or it would have to block, which neither one is a good idea.
No, we shouldn't block. But what we're saying is to fix our sample code so that it actually works, we need to introduce a promise somewhere around the generation of the cert.
Right.
Correct. And the nice thing about the generation of the cert being a promise outside of there is that theoretically you could even do it on page load. You could have a cert getting ready in the background.
Yep.
No, I understand. I want to make sure that we don't make the simplest JavaScript to get a working connection any more complicated than it needs to be.
Yep.
I agree.
So if making the parameter required is no less complex in the simplest possible JavaScript to make a connection work, then having get local parameters be a promise, then the trade-off would be toward making it a required parameter.
Yeah, that's why I thought that way, because there's no simplification by doing it the other way.
So could we type up both possibilities and say, okay, how do these compare?
We could, and we probably should.
And then we'll look at them and say, oh, well, we don't actually win anything by making this optional. Or we'll say, oh, we win a lot. Right now I'm kind of thinking we will not win that much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the notes, we should probably say that generally the certificate management is the way people want to go, but the question is really whether it should be an optional argument or not. And
if it is optional, then we have to make
right.
local parameters a promise anyway.
Yeah, so can someone type that into the IRC?
I'm doing it.
Cool.
Yeah, sorry guys, I'd be helping out there, but I've got limited windows here.
Yeah. As soon as Robin's done, we can move on to the next.
Move on.
Well, one last question around that. So you pass in the algorithm into the method to generate the cert. If you want to do two separate algorithms, can then you pass in two different certs to the DTLS transport?
Yeah, so at least currently, I was actually reading, I reread 57, because I had the same question, Peter, and I reread 5763. What it says currently, and I don't know if, I think this is still accurate, is that the fingerprint algorithm is supposed to be the same as the cert generation algorithm. At least that's what 5763 says. So when you give this keygen algorithm, that is implicit to the fingerprint algorithm as well. And so I guess the key generation algorithm is like a complete cipher suite, if I recall.
I guess what I'm saying is if you wanted to do a situation where you generate RSA and elliptical curve and then you send them both over and then the answer can respond with either, how would you do that? Would you have one DTLS transport or two?
You could call two different generate certificates, have two different certificates, and then only construct your DTLS depending upon what the other guy said. That's another option too.
Yeah, I guess then we run into that whole receiving DTLS packets before.
We run into it anyway, and that's one of the bugs I'm going to come to later on the slide deck.
Yeah.
But this is all for call forking, which...
Right.
Which is, yeah.
It's not so bad if...
No.
It takes a little longer because the packet got dropped.
Yep. Hi, Justin. Actually, we had Just a question for you, Justin.
You can't hear you. I got the headphones on.
Oh, sorry.
Just a heads up, we've got 30 minutes remaining here, guys.
Okay.
No, well, I'm just saying.
All right. So the rest of the 30 minutes is on to the connectivity check issue 170. Take it away, Robin.
Okay, so last week, just a reminder, we discussed the incoming ICE connectivity checks. So let me set up the scenario here. You create an offer, and the answer receives the answer and immediately starts issuing connectivity checks, and of course send the signaling response at the same time. And let's say the connectivity checks arrive before the signaling response of the answer arrives. So you got incoming connectivity checks, which you could in theory respond positively to, but the problem is there's issues related to role and what do we do with those incoming packets, because as soon as you answer, you could immediately start receiving DTLS responses on there. So we already agreed to the answer to this, so this is just a reminder that we discussed this last week. So next slide. And our answer was, well, you could construct an ICE transport with a passed-in ICE gatherer. And what the idea here is that when you do that, sure, when you do that, the ICE gatherer, the ICE transport can be latched automatically by the ICE gatherer to a specific username frag. So if you received an incoming ICE check that has specific username fragment, and an ICE transport was associated to the gatherer, but not yet latched to a particular username frag, the ICE gatherer could automatically latch a username frag to a particular transport and associate it. So that we discussed last week, and we thought, oh, this is a great idea, and it solved other problems too. So, next slide. There was an issue that ended up happening because of that. If you received the signaling and you did not have yet an ICE transport that was latched, you could say, okay, great, I'll do a new ICE transport with this username fragment. The problem is, because it's not atomic, you could end up creating a brand new ICE transport for that signaled username fragment at the same moment one gets latched. Now you got two ICE transports, both handling the same username fragment. So Peter proposed a solution to basically say, let's make that operation atomic. To say, I know I might need a new ICE transport, or I might have already latched one. So you have a method, a static method on the ICE transport that says create or use existing. You pass in your gatherer, you pass in the username fragment that you received over signaling, and either an existing latched transport gets emitted, or a brand new transport, which is also associated with that username fragment, gets created. So you don't know whether it was created, or a new one was created, or an existing one that you already created was used. But the idea here is you get the object back, and then you can call start on it. So that solves the atomic problem, making sure that you only get one transport. So that works great as an answer to that. The downside is that you have you have an ability to new the object in one case, and in the other case you have to construct a new object using the factory. So next slide. This creates a little tiny problem in that the moment that the new ICE transport is constructed and associated, that allows the gatherer to immediately fire back a response to the remote guy. And there's a little tiny window in which the ICE transport could have been newly constructed, but now the gatherer isn't quite, the DTLS transport isn't quite constructed yet. So there's still a little bit of race window that happens. And what can happen is, because you respond to the connectivity check, a DTLS packet that was arriving through a remote party could come to you, have no DTLS transport to go into, and basically that's the hello packet saying, hey, I'm ready to go with the DTLS exchange, but there's no DTLS transport to accept it. So the solution here is pretty easy, but we kind of wanted to avoid it, which is basically you buffer that hello packet that comes in. Or you don't buffer it. Like the other alternatives, we don't buffer, then the retransmission should cause the hello packet to get retransmitted, but that causes a little bit of setup delay. So the idea here is that if you can buffer those little hello packets that come in on your ICE transport, then you're golden. And it's especially true if the DTLS transport takes a little while to construct, because you need to construct a certificate at that same time, because you're talking about a brand new ICE transport. Then you might even have a even greater window in which hello packets could arrive. So buffering might be kind of necessary.
Wait. Why do we need to generate a certificate then?
You missed that part. The forking case, when you create an offer for DTLS, if you can go back, Eric. More.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. One more.
I don't see why that's related to the.
Well, you could pre-create your certificate in advance and have it ready before you even set up anything, so that's a possibility. But if you didn't, you could have an even bigger window, in which case the certificate would need to be generated. But to address Justin's question, in the case of forking, when you create an offer, you're offering a particular certificate based upon a DTLS transport that you've constructed to the remote party. And when the answer comes back, the answer is expected to talk to that certificate in the offer. But if you have multiple answers come back, every single DTLS transport must have the same certificate. And right now we create the certificate with the DTLS transport, making it impossible. So the only way to stop that in the case of a fork is to construct the DTLS certificate external to the DTLS transport and pass it into the DTLS transport.
Right. Yeah.
It's unfortunate but necessary.
So is that the solution, that you just have to always generate and pass in the certificate?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like we should always do it.
Yeah. So next slide, Eric, and you can show Justin that.
Well, that was the question that we were discussing, Justin, whether it would be optional in the constructor or mandatory.
That's what we're talking about right before you.
Next slide. So this is what we proposed, is exactly that. You have a generate certificate, which gets returned. It would be a promise, and then you pass it in the DTLS transport so that it's always there. And then it solves all those forking issues, the RTP versus RTCP, and the rest of it.
Yeah, so the only part of it that's still open is Peter asked, well, if it was made optional, which would kind of make it a little simpler in some cases, we should go through the implications, such as whether you'd have to make get local parameters a promise as well.
Which you would.
I mean, I think it would be better if it was, I think trying to save a step is probably making us having two ways of doing things is just more complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with you.
That's the argument in making it a mandatory part of the constructor.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what we thought we would do is make sample code for both and see.
Fair enough.
Okay, so let's go back to where we were. Next.
Actually, could we ask just Justin a question about I guess it was the stats API. So Justin, there's an open.
Can we hold off, Bernard? And
okay, sure.
Just because I'm going to lose my train of thought here.
Right.
Sorry. Contact switching is difficult at times. So again, there is that small window because the DTLS transport gets constructed after the ICE transport, that the hello packet could arrive when you don't have a DTLS transport. So you might need to buffer a few packets. I don't know if it's so. Next slide.
But that's only an issue with call forking, right? In the non-call forking case, that's not an issue.
No, even in
because you can just create your.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Before you signal anything.
Yeah, you're right. It's only in the case of the forking scenario. Yeah, because you could have the DTLS pre-ready to go and guarantee that you kind of latch to that one because it's the only one that would have been used.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. So it doesn't see, like in the case of forking, the question is, so the question here is the solution acceptable? Is it worth the effort? Do we want a buffer, or just want to say, hey, just, you know what, let the retransmission handle that?
I don't think that's.
Well, first, this is only really an issue for the call forking situation.
Yes.
So for most situations, this isn't having any effect.
Right.
So if we said, okay, we're not going to buffer and we just live with a slight delay in the call setup some percentage of the time for call forking scenarios, that's what we're looking at.
That's what we're looking at.
That would be fine, because then you could still add the buffering in the future without any API changes.
Right. So should we make that the only issue there is in the spec? What do we write? A browser has an implementer has the option to introduce a buffer, because we don't like maze off in our specs. We've shied away from those.
I mean, you can say should. I mean, the spec can do whatever it wants, right?
Yeah.
You know, our expectation is that, you know, there's plenty of shoulds that people say, well, should, but we know you really won't, you know, type of thing. Yeah. And like this may be one of them.
Okay, so let's make it a should in the spec, just so that we address that issue.
Is this, like, Peter, is this consistent with how you were thinking of this? Because I know you had a couple different options.
Yeah, that's consistent. We're basically saying you can do call forking where you're handling the incoming ICE, but there is this window of opportunity where incoming DTLS might not be received properly unless you buffer. But since call forking is less common and this window of opportunity is small, then, you know, it's probably not worth buffering. But if somebody determined it was a real world problem, then we could implement buffering without changing it.
And the thing we talked about previously of having like the pre-creation of the transports, but you don't know which ones are matched up to which, you don't like that solution?
Oh, we do. With Peter's solution, we proposed, and
we're resolving the issue where you have the right ICE transports set up with the right remote UFrag. So that part's solved. So we can have multiple ICE transports all listening for incoming ICE, so the ICE is set up quickly. It's just that at the DTLS level, we might be dropping the hello packet and then requiring a retransmission.
And we can't pre-create the DTLS things in the same way that we're pre-creating the ICE things.
Right.
Right.
All right. Sounds good to me.
Yeah, I think this actually, in the current sample code, it's kind of weird because you have to check every remote candidate to see which ICE candidate goes to, but I think it's going to simplify the sample code as well.
I agree. Okay, so I think we're all on the same page for 170, and if you want to go back one slide just to show the 2 slides, sorry. That was the proposed solution from Peter, which he proposed the list. Creator use existing. I hope I got the name right. Sorry?
I said I'm a stickler for names, and that's not the name I proposed.
Oh, okay, whatever. What did you call it? I'll get the name right.
Get or create transport.
Get or create?
Yeah.
Rename.
But, you know, if somebody comes up with something better, I'm not the greatest name ever.
Well, the thing I just didn't notice that you named it something different. I guess I had it in my head that's what it was called. The only thing I don't like about get is that usually the get implies that you get it from the gatherer and not the ICE transport, but because that's where it's previously associated, so we got a little bit of a, but that's a nitpick. So anyway, we can continue on and we can hash out the name later. That's not really worth delaying the whole meeting for.
Picky about names.
Yeah, I found this name to be like, well, technically correct. You know, it does feel a little clunky.
Yeah, I agree. It's nothing great. So, okay, next. Let's go past issue.
Oh, we're done?
Looks that way. Here, I'll back up one just so we can. This is the last slide on 170.
Oh, okay. So we can. We're done on this then.
There was one.
207. Did you guys broach that with Justin?
Yeah. Yeah.
Go
Bernard
back
has
to
a
that. That
question
would be great.
about get stats.
So there were two. We can come back to this and then go back. But there were two issues around progress in the 1.0 working group around.
Right. Next, back. No, go forward, Eric, to 207. You were just there. Again?
Forward.
Right here?
No.
No, not 207.
And it's
Not 207. Okay.
was the stats API one?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there we go.
214.
So this is issue 214, Justin, and currently in the latest editor's draft of 1.0, it says basically that if the pure connection signaling state is closed, you throw an invalid state error exception. But there's this open issue which basically says, don't do that, return the last stats object. Do you know what the status of that open issue is? Is W3C 1.0 actually going to do that or not?
My understanding was that close would always return like the last thing.
Right, that's what's actually in that PR, in that issue. Okay, so basically in the June editor's draft we changed the ORTC API to be consistent with that, with the issue, and so it'll return the last stats object now. Also, if you call get stats before the objects get started, then it'll return counters of 0 instead of throwing exceptions. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's fine.
Okay. So what was the other issue we wanted to ask Justin about?
Not me. I think Peter had some comments.
Okay.
All right, just around the DTLS transport state. So while writing the pull request for adding DTLS transport in 1.0, there were two states that.
Oh, right. The failed state.
Yeah. So it seemed like there should be a failed state, and people on the 1.0 list thought there should be a failed state, but there's no failed state in RTC. And then there's the question that's not resolved at all, whether we should have a disconnected state.
There's also a question of maybe this is what you just mentioned, but I interpret it differently. Is failed? Can you go from failed to disconnected?
I think failed is clean. It is an ICE, right?
Oh, we're talking about ICE or DTLS?
DTLS.
Well, no. So there's the ICE one. Can you go from failed to disconnected? Then there's
right.
the whole should DTLS have disconnected state. And I think that for a given gatherer or whatever like that, you can't go from failed to disconnected. But certainly from, I guess if you restart ICE, you could go from like failed to like checking or something like that. You can go from disconnected to failed, but I don't really know any state transition that would make sense going from failed to disconnected. Because failed, disconnected is like I'm not connected, but I'm not dead. Whereas failed is like I've given up. And so I don't know what would cause us to go back to disconnected. Unless like maybe received like other candidates or something like that.
Well, if it received other candidates, then it would go into checking because it's got to check them.
Yeah, so the weird thing is there actually is a transition between failed and disconnected in both 1.0 and in ORTC at the moment.
Well, and then you can go from disconnected to checking.
How can you go from failed to disconnected?
Yeah, that one's not super clear to me. I may have written that diagram, so like maybe I need to go read my notes on that.
Maybe you got arrow happy.
See if I can.
That slide's quite early on.
The only thing I could think of is that you received a candidate, you were failed, then you received more candidates after the fact, right. And you decided that you don't want to check those candidates for whatever reasons, you're going directly to disconnected. That seems a little bit bizarre, but it's the only thing I can think of.
Let me see, find the state machine for ICE.
Yeah, so just summarizing this, Justin. So I just checked the diagram for both 1.0 and for ORTC to just see what the differences were. The red arrows were the only differences, and the arrow from connected to checking is there because potentially you could lose consent. So you could have gotten a successful connectivity check and ended up in connected, like be sending media or something, and then consent could fail, and that could bring you back to checking because you still haven't finished all the candidates. So we think that red arrow probably ought to be in 1.0 and seems correct. The one from failed to checking is there around potentially the decisions around non-bis, because in non-bis you could potentially go from failed, I guess, to checking if you got another candidate. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Although I'm not sure, practically speaking, like whether that would actually happen. You know, it would basically be a candidate that was delayed for like a almost indefinite period of time.
Right.
Yeah, it's not. That's. I have to say, I looked at the diagram here, and I still don't quite get where this would occur.
Well, if you have a new interface that, like, if you have the ability to, the only way you can get into failed is if you say, hey, I got no more candidates for the other guy right now. So it goes, oh, I've given up. And then you discover, oh, wait, a new interface has come up. Well, because of that new interface, I don't know if he's hearing me or not, but because of that new interface that come up, you could trickle another candidate and goes, oh, you don't have to give up, now you're going back into checking. But that can only happen in a continuous nomination scenario. It cannot happen in traditional.
Yeah, so an example would be, say you're on a wireless LAN and for some reason it goes down and you end up in failed, and then the person says, okay, I'm fed up with this, I want to bring up my wireless WAN interface even though it costs me money. You bring it up and now the candidate gets trickled and suddenly you're back in checking.
Yeah, but there's a lot of decisions around continuous nomination that need to discuss this before that's a possibility.
Yeah, so the point of this diagram was just to say, hey, are we the same as 1.0 or not, and if so, why? What are the differences? How do they originate?
And I have no knowledge of how to go to failed to disconnected, but I hesitate to take it out because there's always some kind of weird condition where it'll happen.
I mean, I think we just note it. Sorry, we just disappeared. Speaking of disconnected, I think we should note it as this an open question in the spec, and it probably should be resolved in the 1.0 spec.
Right.
Yeah.
The general feeling is failed as a permanent state. And what was the reason you thought that a consent loss would take you back from connected to checking?
Well, that's the scenario where you, for example, get a successful check. You're then able to send media under 5245. So say you start sending media, and then for some reason that candidate pair goes down, like you get a consent loss or maybe the other guy's interface or something, but you're still checking. So then you potentially and you might be checking other pairs in the background, but because you lost connectivity, you wouldn't go to disconnected, you would go to checking in that case.
Yeah, but it still sort of feels like if you haven't gotten consent, like that's, almost isomorphic with, you don't have connectivity.
Well, but you have a successful check, so you actually do have consent. You have to keep maintaining consent, right? But as soon as you get that successful check, you do have consent, and you can send media. And you have to, but you're still checking, so you're saying, hey, do I have anything better? So it's not like it violates consent freshness or anything.
But I don't understand. Are you not connected at that point in time?
You
were connected, so you were connected, right? You got a successful check, you started sending media, you were in the connected state, but then for some reason that pair goes down, like somebody's router went out or something weird like that. And so now you're no longer connected, but you're still checking for other candidates, so that's why we said we go back into checking in that case.
I see. So this would just be like, rather than going back to checking by way of disconnected, you just go back to checking directly.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, I see. And so, because the normal case is you're connected, then you go disconnected, and then as you restart, puts you back into checking.
Right.
You just go directly. That seems consistent to me.
Yeah.
Actually, I just checked in our existing code. We do, in fact, come out of the failed state and we can go into the checking state from the failed state.
But that is not a non-BIS thing, right? It's
So, yeah, that can happen due to like ICE restart.
Yeah.
Actually, anytime we get
right.
we can in the current code we can do this by getting a new remote candidate.
Sure. But that's probably really not what we should be doing.
Okay.
You could even potentially get it because of a new reflexive candidate that comes in after you failed.
Right.
So that's a possibility too.
I think, generally speaking, we just failed should be like a very terminal state, and we really shouldn't go to failed unless we really think that we're done. Because I expect that what the application will do in that case will react to saying like wah wah, and we shouldn't like, hey, it turned out things actually worked, and lead to like very consistent application behavior.
Yeah, I don't understand the distinction between failed and disconnected if you can't go from failed to checking.
The difference is that between disconnected and failed is disconnected, you know the remote guy might send you new candidates, whereas failed is the remote guy said, hey, don't expect any more candidates, they're not coming, right? But the problem is with failed is because of a peer reflexive candidate that might arrive after you've given up, could cause a new candidate pair to emerge that you didn't know about previously. So it is theoretically possible to reemerge from failed, even though I agree with Justin to say most applications will just give up and kill the object at that point.
Right.
Well,
it is technically possible.
My distinction on failed is that disconnected is a case where, hey, you actually were connected at one point, but then you lost the connection, so it seems likely that you can get back to a connection. Whereas failed is like, this person may be behind some firewall or something that's not going to let any WebRTC traffic through, and we just can't get anything working.
Well, to me, they both can happen that way. Either you come from disconnected or you never get to disconnected. So
yeah, it could happen. You get like a network switch, and now you're behind a restricted firewall, and things don't work. But I mean, the semantic distinction, at least for me, is that failed means that you tried everything you could, and it didn't work, and there's no return from this state.
Mm-hmm.
That is like things are interrupted. You can try to recover, but maybe you can recover. Failed is like there's no expectation you can recover from failed.
Right. So in just my own advocation in Trickleize, right? Once you say you're in the end of candidates, even if the peer reflexive showed up, right, you'd still ignore it. Is that correct?
Once the end of candidates showed up, you'd still ignore it?
Yeah, if you got a peer reflexive, like the case Robin was saying, you got a peer reflexive.
Why would
after
a reflexive candidate?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Peter.
Why would you ever ignore a peer reflexive candidate?
I wouldn't. I would consider that a valid candidate.
Why would you just say, oh, I don't care about
But
that?
I mean, the point, like, if we're going to be stickler and say like, end of candidates means end of candidates, then one could interpret that very strictly and say we should ignore any peer reflexive candidate that happens after end of candidates. But I think end of candidates means end of signaled candidates.
Okay,
Yes.
end of signal candidates.
Yeah.
And if we find something internally, then like that's fine. We just don't. The real question is, should one or expect a candidate to magically arrive on a signaling channel? And if we've got end of candidates, then no, you should not expect that.
Right. Yeah, but I think the point is that because of that peer reflexive, it actually is possible to go from failed to checking.
It's theoretically but unlikely.
Theoretically, but unlikely, right?
Yeah. Failed is most likely, hey, you're toast. I mean, it's very unlikely you're going to recover.
Right, and so applications, the directive for applications are you get to fail, display some error message and call .close.
Yeah.
So we have like 2 minutes left.
Well, the reason I brought this up was because of the DTLS transport.
Right.
DTLS transport does seem to be missing failed because there's no way to know closed from failed from like a graceful shutdown versus a hard shutdown. So
on error would go to failed.
Yeah, on error would kind of go to failed in my opinion, but I don't know what other people think of that.
DTLS transport does not currently have a failed state, so I think we should add one.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I agree with you that it should have a failed state, but I don't think it should have a disconnected state. I don't see why we're transposing ICE concepts into.
Right. That's a separate question.
Yes,
So we've got
correct.
one answered, which is add failed state to details transport.
I would like to see that added myself.
Yeah, if you could file that, Peter, that would be great.
It would take me a little while to remember how to do that.
Well, I'm putting it in the
Okay.
the chat at least on
Okay.
the IRC little note, so hopefully we'll not forget.
Just a question: do we need a state diagram for DTLS?
Oh, please, hopefully
Okay.
not.
Okay.
Probably, but I don't want to do it.
You don't want to do it. Okay. Because I didn't notice one in any of the RFCs.
We'll just copy and paste this one and delete a few boxes and arrows.
Okay. And then we can talk about whether the arrows are the right there or not. Okay.
I think if we describe it well enough, we should be okay. But anyway, because it's kind of a flow through where you don't recover from it, unlike ice where you can kind of recover. So I think it's a little bit different.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would not want to add a disconnected state to the DTLS. To me, when you're connected, and unless there's a failure or a closure, that's it. It's good.
Okay.
And that allows you to swap an ice, to do some things in ice to try and fix your state too.
Yeah. So just one thing before we close, could we just go over the action items, Eric, and just make sure we all understand what they are?
Yeah, so I can't actually look at the IRC right now. My windows are all screwed up. So somebody else.
So candidate complete, we discussed about converting that into a method instead of a specialized dictionary, especially considering WebRTC 1.0 removed the nullable candidate being added. And Peter and Chijing agreed. And sorry, looking at the other stuff. The ice transport, we had to review those we have to review the ice transport states because they seem maybe a little bit off, so we have to really think about this a little bit harder, and there might be some pending decisions in non-biz that might affect things. Closed off, just get stats. What do we do with get stats on closed object? I think we got our answer to that, which is make sure that we don't throw exceptions anymore, but we just return kind of the last state that we know about.
That's what's in the current June editor's draft, so I think there's no change required.
Okay, good. Generation for the generation field on ice candidates, we're not going to add that because it doesn't make sense for ORTC. The DTLS now is going to require a certificate being passed in, which is created from a static method with a promise for the certificate. And then we're going to add should buffer for incoming packets from the ice transport to the DTLS transport if one isn't attached. We're going to add the get or create transport method to the ice transport to resolve that race condition with the username fragment. And then we're going to add a failed state to the DTLS transport. I think that's it.
Okay, so we will not change get local parameters in DTLS to a promise.
No.
Okay.
No, that just adds more complexity that we don't need. I agreed with Justin on that one completely.
Okay.
So I got it up here, so are all the action items filed here?
Oh no, we got to file them. So
no, are they listed in the minutes here?
I believe so. I tried to capture everything that was going on, at least a little one-liner.
Okay. Cool. I'll try to assemble that into action items and make sure that they get filed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Actually, there's a few we're missing. I think. I guess Peter was going to file a PR in WebRTC 1.0 to change the spelling of DTMF.
Or DTLS, DTMF sender.
Okay, Robin, you doing it?
Case. Okay.
I think that's the only other thing that I remember.
Oh. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to welcome a new entrant to this community group, Justin Skinner, has joined us on the call here. Welcome, Justin. And Justin had sent an email into the contribute mail list pointing out that he may like to help out with some of the JavaScript work that has to be done around the lib. So welcome, Justin.
Hey.
Brilliant.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I'm a JavaScript guy, and you kind of saw me on and off the call here. I had some problems. But if you've got any issues with the client side on it, feel free. I'll shoot out my email again to everyone, and hopefully we can get it happen.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'd be appreciated.
I'll send you an email, Justin, just to let you know whereabouts you can be sending this stuff. It should likely be going to the public-ORTC list, and maybe we can get you involved in the open source efforts around the ORTC library.
Sounds like a plan. I'll look for it.
Thanks for joining in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, I think that pretty much wraps it up. Does anybody have anything else they want to add to the minutes here and before we wrap up?
So, sorry, I missed a little bit when I changed meeting groups. Are you going to email out the action items?
Yes, that was one of my action items, is to kind of
okay.
summarize this in action items and make sure that it gets onto the list, and also from there it gets into the onto the issues list.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Only thing I'd like to ask, not really to add to the minutes per se, but is there a good location to kind of get a beginner's crash course through the body of work? Because it's quite extensive.
There is an ORTC lib deck, and I'll shoot that off to you.
I must have missed it then.
Well, that's more about the lib, Eric. I think from a JavaScript programmer's developer's perspective, we don't really have a good overview, like a walkthrough. I did do something for
jQuery.
Yeah, I did it for was it?
jQuery.
No, not jQuery. No. Very recently, I think it was the FreeSwitch guys.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. We should dig out that presentation, and we can send that to him. And I think that would be about the best overview to start. And I got some slides around that.
Yeah, I should add that the FreeSwitch people have asked us to show up again, I guess, to ClueCon and do a presentation. So that might be an opportunity to help improve that presentation or make a better one or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe Justin can help out there.
Of course, I assume they've gotten to both Justin and Peter as well. I don't know if you.
I haven't heard anything from FreeSwitch or whatnot.
There's an ORTC roundtable, ORTC WebRTC roundtable happening at ClueCon in Chicago in August. So you'll be able to find out more about that on the freeswitch.org. Is it the freeswitch.org or freeswitch.com?
Search ClueCon and you'll find it.
Yeah.
ClueCon. I just put it in the IRC channel. If you scroll down a bit, or something's gone wrong with your IRC, I'll put it in the other window.
So I'll get some links out to Justin, and we'll go from there. See if we can get you pointed in the right direction, and maybe get some of your input on some of the stuff that we've been doing.
It's early in August, so I was feeling probably going to be a bit comatose after Prague, or maybe even still be there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do it remotely, but.
Yeah, I'm going to be there in person in the Chicago August one. So for ClueCon.
Hi, this is Roman here. Can you send me the presentation as well for the?
For the ClueCon?
Yeah, for the FreeSwitch with the JavaScript overview.
Maybe we should just post that to the ORTC community group list. That's the easiest way to get it to everybody.
Post previous ClueCon meeting video and slides.
Although to be fair, Roman, that JavaScript is about to change with some of the things we discussed today. So
yeah,
in case it's probably going to change a lot, but.
Oh, I understand that. We just need to. We're bringing some new people on board, so I was just thinking that would be a good thing to get them started as well.
Yeah, I don't claim it's the best presentation in the world, but it's a good primer, I think, to start. And obviously, it doesn't include today's discoveries.
Yes.
So, I'll be doing another one come August, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to say a few words about ORTC Lib in general, Robin, just before we close?
Yeah, making some great progress. We have unit tests around the ice gather, the ice transport. Works very well. We've got the unit test now around DTLS transport. So now we've got
certificate API, right?
And we've implemented the certificate API already, according to what we proposed today. We just jumped ahead because I wanted to see if it makes sense and how it affects the implementation, and it actually works out quite nicely. So I was very happy about that. Yeah, that's all implemented and working quite well now. So we're making some really great progress. Next thing for me is concentrating around the listener and sender and receiver stuff. So I'm definitely going to be making some progress in that area. So all of those upcoming stuff that we talked about, I'm really going to need soon to be able to implement it.
That's basically what Robin just gave us, a little update. And for those who will be watching this after the fact, we ask that anybody interested in taking a look at what we're doing in the ORTC community group to join us. You don't have to be a member of the W3C and be contributing to the open standards and open source communities. Thanks to all the people for helping us put this together. Here are the main links for the community group, and if anybody has any further comments, let them rip or we're going to shut her down. Okay, well, thanks for everybody for joining. We'll see you next time. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye, guys.